1. The Time Machine. Chapter 1. The Fourth Dimension. We sat in comfortable chairs. They were designed by the time traveler, as we shall call him. "Listen carefully to what I say," he said. "I shall make statements with which you will not agree." "Why will we not agree?" I asked. "Because the science and mathematics you know are not correct," he said. "You believe there are only 3 dimensions, length, breadth, and thickness." "There is nothing to argue with that," the youngest member of our little group said. "Exactly," the time traveler answered. "But there is also a 4th dimension, time." "We all know about time," another member of the group said. "Time passes." "I do not agree," the time traveler said. "Length, breadth, and thickness do not pass. They stay in the same place in space. We move about them. I can prove that time is the same. It does not pass. We move in time the same way that we move in breadth, length, and thickness." None of us believed the time traveler, and we argued with him for many hours. "If we could travel back in time," the scientist remarked, "we could do things to change the future. If we could travel forward in time," the doctor said, "we could do things that change our present." The time traveler smiled. "It is clear," he said, "that there is only one way I can convince you that I am right. We must conduct an experiment. Please wait here." He left the room and we heard him walking toward his laboratory. He soon returned. He was carrying what looked like a clock. "This is a model of a time machine," he said. "I plan to build such a machine. Notice that there are 2 white levers." "The model is very well made," the doctor commented. "It took me 2 years to make," the time traveler said. "I want all of you to understand that when I move the first white lever, the machine will immediately travel in time. It will disappear from the present. It will leave this room." He turned to the youngest of us. "Give me your hand," he said. The young man put out his hand. The time traveler took it and placed it on the lever. "Now, move the lever down a little way and quickly pull back your hand." The young man did as he was asked. Immediately, there was a sudden wind, and the little machine disappeared. I was certain this was not a trick, but the doctor was not so sure. "Are you asking us to believe," he said, "that the machine is now in a different time?" "Certainly," the time traveler answered. "Did you notice that in the model there was a seat?" "I noticed that," I said. "That is for the time traveler to sit in," he remarked. "In my laboratory, a full-size machine is almost complete. As soon as it is complete, I shall sit in the seat and send myself on a journey through time." "Which way did the model go?" the scientist asked. "Into the future or into the past?" "I do not know," the time traveler answered. "That is something I still have to work on." He smiled at us. "Would you like to see my machine? It is in my laboratory." "Are you serious about this?" the doctor asked. "I have never been more serious about anything," the time traveler said. "Come." We followed him to his laboratory. There, we saw the actual machine, not quite complete, but large enough for a man to sit in. Chapter 2. The time traveler leaves and returns. Our little group met every Thursday at the time traveler's house. Between the time he showed us his model and the next meeting, we did not meet one another, so we did not talk about the time machine. I think, though, that all of us were suspicious. The time traveler was a friend, but he was a man who often had strange ideas. When I arrived at his house the next Thursday, 4 or 5 men were already there. The doctor was standing in front of the fire with his watch in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. "It's 7:30 now," he said. "Shall we start dinner?" "Where is the time traveler?" I asked. "Shouldn't we wait for him? We are guests in his house." "I have a note from him," the doctor said, holding up the piece of paper. "It says he will be late and that we should start dinner first." "In that case," the editor of a newspaper said, "let's go into the dining room." He rang the bell to tell the housekeeper that we were ready to eat. Not all the men present knew about the model of the time machine. Only the doctor and the psychologist knew. During dinner, we described the model to the other guests. I suggested jokingly that perhaps our host was late because he was traveling in time. The laughter suddenly changed to shock, however, when the door opened and the time traveler stood there. His clothes were dirty and torn. His face was white, and his chin had a cut on it. At first he said nothing but walked slowly to the table. I saw that he had a bad limp. He quickly poured himself a glass of wine and drank it. "That's better," he said. "What's happened?" the doctor demanded. "I'll tell you later," the time traveler said. "Now I am going to wash and change my clothes. Don't wait for me for you to start dinner. I'll join you soon." And he limped out of the room. As he did so, I noticed that he was not wearing shoes. He was wearing only blood-stained socks. The journalist asked, "What kind of trouble is he in?" "I think it has something to do with his time machine," I said. "Perhaps there aren't any dry cleaners in the future," the editor said with a laugh. "Or soap and water," the psychologist added. I said nothing. I did not mention his limp, and neither did any of the others. The housekeeper came into the dining room to serve the meal, and the conversation stopped. When we were halfway through the meal, the time traveler came into the room. "Where have you been?" the editor asked, laughing. "In the middle of next week?" The time traveler sat at the table and put food on his plate. "It's so good to eat good food again," he said. "We want to hear your story," the editor said. "You will hear it," the time traveler said, "but not until I have had my meal." "Just one quick question," I said. "Have you been time traveling?" "Yes," he said. We all sat silently until he finished his meal. Then he said, "I must apologize, but I was very hungry. I've had the most amazing experience." He stood up. "Let's go into the sitting room and make ourselves comfortable. My story is a long one." He turned to me. "Have you told them all about my machine?" he asked. "Yes," I answered, "but they either do not believe you or do not understand how it can work." "I'm not going to explain again," he said. "I'll tell you my story. If you think I am lying, then that's for you to decide. I have lived for 8 days the way no human has ever lived before. I'm exhausted, but I cannot sleep until I have told my story. When I have done so, I shall go to bed. Now, do you all agree to listen without interrupting me?" We said we would. We sat in comfortable chairs and listened to the strangest story ever told. Chapter 3. Past the Moon and the Stars. "When we last met," the time traveler said, "I showed you my time machine." "It was not complete," I said. "You still had work to do on it." "Yes, and I soon completed it. Come with me, and you will see." We followed him into his laboratory. The machine was standing in the middle of the room. It did not look new and shiny now. It looked very worn. Parts of it were bent and broken. "I completed the machine this morning," the time traveler said. I put some oil on the moving parts and sat in the chair. I held the starting lever in my right hand and the stopping lever in my left. I held my breath and pulled the starting lever. Immediately, the room seemed to go round and round, and I felt very strange. Quickly, I pulled the stopping lever. Only a fraction of a second passed. The room stopped spinning, and I stopped feeling strange. I saw that I was still in my laboratory. The machine does not travel in time, I thought. I'm exactly where I was before I pulled the starting lever. Then I looked at the clock. The time was nearly 3:30. The time when I pulled the lever was a minute or so after 10. "In less than a second," the doctor said, "you traveled 5 hours." "That is what I thought," the time traveler said. "I decided to travel further." I pulled the starting lever again. As before, the room began to spin, and I felt strange. This time, I did not stop the machine. I let it continue. I saw my housekeeper enter the room and move around the room without seeing me or my machine. I was obviously not there for her to see. I pulled the lever down farther. Now the laboratory itself disappeared. Everything disappeared except for the moon and the stars. I was moving faster and faster. Soon I could not even see the moon and stars. I had no idea where I was or when everything was happening. "Why didn't you pull the stopping lever?" the editor asked. "I was worried about what might happen if I did," the time traveler answered. But at last I knew I had to take that chance. If I don't try to stop, I thought, I could travel to the beginning of the universe, and then what would happen to me? I pulled hard on the stopping lever. Immediately I was thrown into the air, and there was a great bang. I landed on the ground. The machine was on its side a few meters away. Heavy rain was falling, and there was a thick fog. I could see very little except for what looked like a giant statue some meters away. It had sightless eyes and a thin, cruel smile on its face. It seemed to come toward me, and then move away as I looked at it. Was this statue a likeness of the people in this place, I wondered? If it was, then were the people as big and as cruel as the statue looked? It was not a happy thought. He continued to tell his amazing story. I stood up and looked around me. I was getting very wet. I thought I might find some shelter from the rain. Then I saw in the distance the shapes of huge buildings. The rain soon stopped and the fog cleared. I could see more clearly. I was now very frightened. What were these buildings? What kind of people lived or worked in them? I had to try to get away. I moved toward my machine and tried to lift it upright. It was very heavy, and I hurt my legs and back. But at last I got the machine upright. With escape now possible, I became braver. I looked toward the buildings again. To my surprise, a circular opening appeared in one of them. A group of figures came out. They walked toward me. They were wearing rich, soft robes. They waved to show that they could see me. Then I heard voices nearby. I turned and saw the heads and shoulders of man-like creatures running through the bushes. One of them came out of the bushes and ran toward me. He was just over a meter tall and very thin. He was wearing a long robe with a leather belt and sandals. I was surprised by how beautiful and graceful he was. I was also surprised at how warm the air was. I did not feel afraid now, and I took my hands off from my machine. Chapter 4. The Time Traveler and the Little Creatures. The time traveler paused for a moment as he thought back to his adventure. Then he continued. The little man-like creature came up to me and looked into my face. Then he began laughing. I realized that he was not even a little frightened of me, and I thought this was strange. He then turned to two others who were following him and spoke to them. He did not use a language I knew, and it was a strange, rather liquid noise. By now, about 10 of the creatures were surrounding me. They began gently touching me, as if to make sure that I was real. I was not at all frightened, though. I worried that one of them might touch my machine. I quickly unscrewed the two levers and put them in my pocket. Now they could not send my machine to any place or any time. As they examined me, I examined them. Their faces were pretty, and their curly hair ended at their ears and cheeks. Their ears were very small, as were their mouths. They had bright red, rather thin lips and pointed chins. Their eyes, though, were quite large. To my surprise, they did not attempt to communicate with me, so I tried to communicate with them. I pointed to the time machine and then to myself. I did not know how to communicate the idea of time travel, so I pointed to the sun. Immediately, one of them made a noise like thunder and looked at me questioningly. Did this mean, I thought, that he thought I was a visitor from the sun? If he did, then these little people of the future were not very clever. It was the kind of question a child would ask. I was very disappointed. These people of the future have nothing to teach us, I thought. Anyway, I pointed to the sun again and made a noise like thunder. They all moved back a little and bowed. Then one of them came forward with a flower necklace and put it around my neck. Then, laughing, they all ran around picking flowers and throwing them at me. These flowers of the future were amazingly beautiful. One of them now had the idea of taking me to one of the buildings. The others excitedly agreed, and I followed them into a huge building. It is difficult to describe how big this building was. I can only say that it was like a cathedral of our own time, but with a roof of colored glass and a floor that seemed to be made of some kind of metal. There were piles of strange fruits on large stone tables everywhere. There were cushions between the tables. Everyone sat down on the cushions, and I did the same. They immediately began to eat fruit. I was hungry and thirsty, so I did the same, hoping it would not poison me. No one talked. There were at least 200 of them, all eating and looking at me. They were all wearing the same kind of robe. I decided to try and talk to them. I began by pointing to one of the fruits and, by signs, tried to tell them that I wanted to know its name. At first, they only laughed at me, and then one of them made a sound that I thought was a name. I tried to repeat the sound, but I could not make the right kind of soft, liquid sound that they made. This made them all laugh. But I was making progress, and soon I was teaching them the most important English verbs, such as to eat. I then noticed a strange thing. They were not really interested in me. They came up to me, but soon lost interest and walked away. Soon, there was no one in the hall who was interested in me. I decided to go outside, and no one followed me. I met some more of them outside, but they were not very interested in me. The editor interrupted the time traveler and asked, "Do you know when all this was happening?" "I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you," the time traveler said. "There is a dial on my machine." It read 802,701. The scientist asked, "Did you travel in time or also in space?" "In time only," the time traveler said. "I was still in the same place, although when I climbed the top of a hill, I saw that the River Thames was not in exactly the same place." "That is not surprising," the scientist said. "As time passes, rivers usually change their courses." Chapter 5. Exploring the Ruins. As I walked around, I noticed that many of the buildings were almost in ruins. They needed repairing. Some of them were little more than piles of stone covered with weeds and other plants. I wondered why so many of the buildings were in ruins. I wondered why the people who lived here did not seem to care about them. The next thing I noticed was that there were no small buildings. There were no houses of any kind, only large buildings. Did this mean, I thought, that they all lived together? And then I noticed something else. The man-like creatures all looked the same. They all wore the same clothes. There was no difference in appearance between the males and the females. The children were just little versions of the adults. I wondered if this sameness was because the society was so peaceful. There was no need for family units. As I was thinking these things, I came to a well. I thought it was strange that people of the future needed to get water from wells and walked up to take a close look at it. By this time, I was completely alone. No one was interested in me anymore. There was a seat made of some kind of yellow metal near the well, and I sat down on it. I looked around me and into the distance. There were a few large buildings, but the countryside was mostly empty. There were no farms and no agriculture. There were only flowers growing and the river flowing. The whole place was like a garden. I thought to myself, these people no longer have the problems that we have. They have solved the difficulties of feeding themselves and fighting disease. They have everything they want. What does this mean? "Life must be very boring," the editor said. The time traveler smiled. "That was exactly what I thought," he said. I began to think that the human race was so changed that it had no way to improve. From now on, it could only go backwards. Life was just too easy. Because there is no hardship, I thought, these people have become smaller. They are less intelligent. They are not interested in anything, which is why there are so many ruins. They do not want to take the trouble to repair anything. I did not see any art or hear any music. I thought that there were probably no books. These people, I thought, have become weak and stupid because they do not need to be strong and clever. It was a simple explanation, and like most simple explanations, completely wrong. I turned to go back to my machine. To my horror, it was not there. I ran toward where it should be, but there was no sign of it. At first I thought, perhaps the creatures have moved it to keep it safe. But I knew this was not the answer. They were not capable of such an action. But how else could it have moved? I asked myself. I had the starting and stopping levers in my pocket. Only another time machine could make it move in time. I ran around shouting and crying. I was more frightened than I've ever been in my life. I was stuck in a future time. I had no means of returning to my own time. I ran into the huge hall. It was now dark and empty. I moved through this hall to a smaller one. This was full of cushions on which hundreds of the little creatures were sleeping. "Where is my time machine?" I shouted. "What have you done with it?" I tried to wake some of them by shaking them. Some of them ran away. Others looked at me in amazement. They had no idea what I wanted or what I was shouting about. I ran out of the hall back into the huge garden. I ran here, there, and everywhere, but I could not find my machine. Finally, exhausted, I laid down on the ground and slept. Chapter 6. Inside the Pedestal. It was morning when I awoke. In daylight, I was able to think more clearly. I realized that running around and shouting would not help me find the machine. Someone knew where it was. I had to find that person. I also had to make friends with the little creatures. I wanted the tools and metal from them that I needed in case I had to make another machine. But I now felt there was no real hurry. There was plenty of food, and no one was trying to hurt me. I felt dirty and needed to wash, but I could not find a stream or pool. I walked around the garden for a while. There were not many little creatures in the garden, and I spoke to them gently. They just laughed and ran away from me as if I were some kind of game. Then I came to the tracks of my machine. There were marks on the ground where it landed. I saw my footprints, and more interestingly, other footprints. These were too big and narrow to be the little creatures. I thought perhaps they belonged to some kind of animal. There was also a large pedestal made of stone. I knocked on it. It sounded hollow. There were no handles or keyholes, but there were panels. Perhaps I thought they can be opened only from inside the pedestal. I thought that my machine was probably inside the pedestal. I could not figure out how it got there or how I could get to it. There were some little creatures nearby. I went up to them and pointed at the pedestal. They were horrified. They made me feel as if I were being rude to someone of great importance. They ran away, so I ran after them and caught one of them. I pulled him, or perhaps it was a her, I couldn't tell, back with me to the pedestal. He was terrified and tried to get away from me. He was frightened of the pedestal. I let him go. I picked up a large stone and began hitting the pedestal with it. I thought I heard a laugh from inside. Something moved inside the pedestal. I sat down and stared at the pedestal. If my machine was inside, then somehow I had to get it out. I thought to myself, if they want to take the machine away from me, they will. If they don't, then perhaps I can persuade them to give it back to me. To do this, I must study and understand their ways. And then I began to laugh. For years, it was my passion to travel into the future. Now that I was in the future, all I wanted to do was leave it. I thought this was very funny. I spent the next few days trying to get to know and understand the little creatures. I began to learn their language. It was a very simple one and useless for communicating any difficult ideas. It seemed to only have names of things and names of simple actions. I also started to explore my surroundings. The landscape was very much as it is in our time, except that there were none of the buildings we know. The buildings were very large and shiny, and made of many different kinds of materials and in many different styles. There were wells here and there. They were very deep, and I could not see water in them or the bottom of the well. I thought I heard the sound of machinery coming up from the wells. I held a piece of paper over a well, and it was immediately sucked down into the well. I thought perhaps they were ventilation shafts bringing down fresh air to some kind of sewer. I later found out that this idea was completely wrong. Chapter 7. The Morlocks. The more I explored, the more puzzled I became. The buildings were large and well built, but there were no machines or tools anywhere. The little creatures wore fine clothes, but there were no tailors and no shops. No one did any work. They spent their time playing, bathing in the river, eating, and sleeping. I could not understand how the place continued to work. Who did the work? Where were the factories and kitchens? I began to think about the pedestal. Why was my machine inside it? And what was happening at the bottom of the deep wells? I needed someone to explain these matters to me. Very soon, I found someone. It was on my 4th day in this strange place. I was walking along the path by the river when one of the little people fell in. I could see that I felt like it was a female, could not swim. To my surprise, none of the other little creatures showed any interest in her. They were letting her drown. I quickly took off my clothes and dove into the river. I swam toward the little woman and pulled her toward the river bank and onto the path. I left her there. I did not expect gratitude. However, I was wrong. In the afternoon, she ran up to me and gave me a bunch of flowers. She kissed my hands. We sat down and talked as much as we were able. She told me her name was Weena. This was the beginning of a friendship. Sadly, it lasted only a week. During this time, she followed me everywhere. She was like a child that will not leave the side of her mother. Even at night, she wanted to be with me. I realized that her fear was not of being alone at night. She was afraid of the dark. They were all afraid of the dark. As soon as night came, they all went into the halls and stayed together until morning. At first, I would not allow her to stay with me at night, and I made her go into the great hall with the others. But she was so afraid, I changed my mind and allowed her to sleep by my side. She did this for 5 nights. On the 4th night, I slept badly. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but I realized that what I was seeing was not a dream. There were large, ghostly, ape-like figures moving around. 4 of them were carrying what looked like a body. When daylight came, they all disappeared. The next day, I came to the entrance of a narrow tunnel. It was black inside, but then I saw a pair of bright eyes watching me from inside the darkness. At first, I was too afraid to enter the tunnel, but I made myself take a step inside. I put my hand out in front of me. I touched something soft. Before it ran off, I saw that it was whitish in color, with grayish-red eyes and golden hair down its back. It moved away so quickly that I could not see if it moved on 4 legs or 2. What was the creature? I thought. Was it possible that there were 2 kinds of human life? Was one kind the little creatures who lived above the ground? Was the other the ape-like people who lived below ground? Were the wells ventilating shafts? Was their home a network of underground tunnels? The more I thought about this, the more reasonable an explanation it seemed. My theory now was that the ape-like people did all the work. The little creatures lived lives of comfort and leisure. Everything they needed was provided by the ape-like people who were their slaves. I later discovered that the underground people were called Morlocks. I already knew from Weena that her people were the Eloi. I tried to get Weena to explain why the Eloi were so afraid of the dark, and why the Morlocks were keeping my time machine. She refused to answer my questions and started to cry. I stopped and changed the subject, and she was soon laughing again. Chapter 8. The Smell of Blood. I knew that the answers to my questions were underground. I disliked the Morlocks, but I had to go where they lived. The next morning, with Weena by my side as usual, I went to one of the wells. I looked down. For the first time, I saw that there was an iron ladder on the inside of the well. It was very deep. I was very afraid, but I knew that unless I could get back to my time machine, I could never leave this place and return to my own time. I began to climb into the well. Weena tried to stop me. She took hold of my clothes and pulled and cried. I pulled myself free and began to climb down. I was about 200 meters down when one of the rungs on the ladder beneath my feet broke. I almost fell, but I was able to hold on with one hand. By now, the noise of the machinery was much louder. My arm ached, and I thought about turning back. I looked up and could see a small circle of light. There was no sign of Weena. Although I was in pain, I continued climbing downwards. I came to a hole in the wall of the well. I pushed myself into it. The hole led into a tunnel. I had my matches with me, and I struck one. In the light of the match, I saw 3 of the Morlocks running away. Because they lived in the darkness, their eyes were very large, and they hated the light. As I moved in the tunnels, I passed smaller tunnels on each side. In these tunnels, I saw Morlocks hiding from me. I tried to speak to them, but without success. I came to a large cave. I could see the shapes of great machines. The air was warm and not very pleasant. There was a smell of blood. I saw a large table with a piece of meat on it. I wondered what animal it came from. As I stood looking around, the Morlocks came from out of the shadows. They surrounded me, touched me, and pulled at my clothes. One of them tried to take away my box of matches, of which there were now only 4 left. I held on to it. The creatures had a strange smell about them. I shouted at them. They ran away but soon came back again. I struck a match, hoping that the light would keep them away from me. I began to run back into the tunnel. They ran after me. I struck another match, then another and another. I struck my last match as I reached the well. As I took hold of the ladder, the Morlocks tried to take hold of me, but I kicked them away and began to climb. I felt ill, and several times I nearly fell. At last I reached the top of the well and climbed out. I fell to the ground and lay there. I heard voices of the Eloi. I felt and saw Weena kissing my hand, and then I lost consciousness. When I became conscious again, I realized my situation was now worse than before. It was not only the Eloi, the little creatures I had to worry about, but I had to also worry about the Morlocks, the ape-like creatures that lived underground. The Eloi were afraid of the Morlocks, and, I was sure, would not help me get my time machine back from them. I also realized why the Eloi were so afraid of the dark. It was in darkness that the Morlocks came out from their underground tunnels. At one time, I thought the Morlocks were probably the slaves of the Eloi, but I no longer thought this. I wondered why the Morlocks continued to provide food and clothes for the Elois. I remembered seeing the piece of meat on a table in the underground cave. I wondered if there was a possible connection between this and the services the Morlocks provided. I decided that somehow I had to make or find a weapon and a place where I could be safe from attack. I was not worried about the Eloi. I was very worried about the Morlocks. Soon the moon would stop shining and everything would be dark. I thought that many Morlocks would then come to the surface. I decided to go to the hills. Carrying Weena on my shoulders like a child, I set off. They were at least 30 kilometers away. By the time I arrived, my shoes were worn and I was lame. It was also dark and we lay down to sleep. Weena fell asleep immediately. I lay on the ground staring at the stars for some time. I thought about what I knew about the Morlocks. I wondered if the meat on the table was Eloi meat. It was such a horrible thought that I tried to stop thinking about it, and at last I fell asleep. The next morning, I took Weena into the forest, where we found and ate fruit for breakfast. There were other Eloi in the forest doing the same. As I watched them running happily, I knew without a doubt that I was watching cattle. They were the Morlocks' meat. I knew now that it was important not only that I make a weapon, but also that I find fire. If I could take fire underground, the Morlocks would keep away from me, and perhaps I would find my time machine. Chapter 9. Escape. In the distance, there were ruins of a huge building. It was nothing like the buildings the Eloi lived in. It was more like a building of our own time. I decided to explore it and set off with Weena running by my side. When we reached the building, I knew immediately what it was. It was the ruins of a museum, probably the British Museum and Library, one of the largest and most important buildings of our own time. I hurried inside, hoping to find something of use to me. There were dust and broken exhibits everywhere, stuffed animals, skeletons, machinery, rocks, badly damaged books and pictures, everything one finds in a large museum. There were footprints in the dust. I decided they were made by the Morlocks. I looked everywhere for a weapon, but could not find one. I did, however, find a dry, unused box of matches and some candles. I was also able to break a lever off a machine. I held it up in my hand. I now had a strong club to fight off a Morlock attack. I decided to leave the museum before dark and head for the woods. We had to hurry because there was no moonlight. As we walked along, I picked up small pieces of wood and started a small fire with it. I thought I saw movements behind the trees. I knew that soon there would be many Morlocks moving about. I decided to move deeper into the forest. As we hurried through the trees, Weena, who was now very afraid, held on to me. Then suddenly, we were surrounded by Morlocks. Weena was so afraid that she fell to the ground unconscious. I was able to get the box of matches out of my pocket and light one. Immediately, the Morlocks ran away. Then the match went out, and the Morlocks came back. One ran up to me, and I hit him with a lever. He tried to run away, but he fell down. Quickly, I lit another match and found some more small pieces of wood. Soon I had a fire, which I made bigger with tree branches. I knew I was safe. The Morlocks were too afraid of the fire to come near me again. Weena was still unconscious, and I felt very tired. Within a few minutes, I fell asleep by the heat of the fire. I awoke many hours later to find that we were surrounded by Morlocks. My fire was out. The Morlocks were no longer afraid, and began to move toward me. I felt for my box of matches in my pocket. It was not there. Morlock hands took hold of me. They began pulling at my clothes and hair. I believed my end was near. Then suddenly, they all turned and ran away. At first, I could not understand why. Then I saw red flames moving toward me. The forest was burning. I remembered my first fire. I guessed that a wind made it spread and set fire to nearby trees. Now I was in the middle of a forest fire. I had to escape from it. I looked around for Weena, but I could not see her anywhere. I called and called, but there was no answer. The Morlocks got her, I thought, as I ran ahead of the huge flames. I don't know how long I ran, but I came to the end of the forest. I was safe from the fire and from the Morlocks. There was no sign of Weena. I was alone. I missed little Weena and felt very, very sad. I sat down to rest and put a hand in my pocket. To my surprise and delight, my fingers felt a few matches. The box was gone, but some of the matches were in my pocket. I would be able to make a fire to frighten off the Morlocks if necessary. I rested for a while and then returned to the pedestal. To my surprise, there was an opening on the side. I could see my time machine. I entered the pedestal and examined my machine. It was in good condition. The Morlocks have repaired the damage, I thought. I had the 2 levers in my pocket. I screwed them in place. Now, I thought, I can escape. Even as I thought this, I wondered why the Morlocks were letting me go. Then I heard laughter. The door behind me closed. I was in the dark. I felt hands pulling at me. I had to do something, and quickly. My levers were in place. I got into the seat, but it was not in the correct position. I was sitting sideways. I pulled the lever to send me back in time. Chapter 10. What is the truth? The machine shook. I held on tightly. I looked at the dials. To my horror, the needle was moving strangely and differently. My hand was on the wrong lever. I pulled the lever hard and the machine stopped. I looked around me. There was no pedestal. Instead, I was on a beach. The sun was a deep red. The air was hot. Suddenly, I heard a roar. A giant crab was moving toward me. I heard a noise above me. A huge bird-like creature that was not a bird flew past me. Everywhere I looked, there were monsters, forms of life unknown to me. The sun disappeared and it was dark. There was no moon. I knew I had to try to get away from this terrible place. From what I knew, this was prehistoric times, the days of the dinosaurs. I pulled the correct lever. Again the machine shook, and within minutes it seemed I was back in my laboratory. I got off the machine and sat down, shaken and exhausted. Was it all a dream? I asked myself. But I knew it was not. The machine was not in its usual place in the laboratory. Why was this, I wondered? And then I knew the answer. The Morlocks had moved it when they carried it into the pedestal. I looked on my table and saw a newspaper there. The date was today's. I looked at my watch. The time was nearly 8 o'clock. It was the time for our usual weekly meeting. I heard your voices from my sitting room. I went to join you and tell you my story. You probably don't believe a word of it. He put his hand in his pocket to take out some matches to light his pipe. Some dried flowers fell from the pocket. The doctor picked one up. I have never seen a flower like this, he said. Do you know what it is? The time traveler shook his head. They were put into my pocket by Weena, he said. We all looked at one another. We thought he was mad. Perhaps it was a dream, he said. Perhaps I do not have a time machine. It is late, the editor said. We must go. We left the time traveler and returned to our homes. I tried to sleep but could not. His story was impossible, and yet it was full of detail. The next day I went to his house. He was in his laboratory. The time machine was standing in its place. He was getting into it. He had a camera and a bag under one arm. I can't talk to you now, he said. I'm really busy. I can see you are, I said. Tell me, can you really travel in time? Yes, and this time I will prove to you that I can. Wait here for me. I shall only be half an hour. I went into the sitting room and read a magazine. Half an hour passed. An hour passed. Then a whole day passed. I went into the laboratory. The time machine was not there. The time traveler has never been seen since that day, and that was 3 years ago. 2. Wade's Medicine. Chapter 1. Wade's Nerves.
18 years ago, when Wade was about 30 years of age, he was a failure. This was surprising because he was a clever man and most people liked him. Old ladies liked him very much because he was always very polite to them. Young ladies, however, were not interested in him. They did not dislike him, but they thought he was too timid. They liked men who had stronger personalities. Wade's best friend was a doctor, an older man named Manningtree. One day Manningtree said to Wade,
"I have known you for many years, Wade, and I am surprised you are such a failure. I don't understand why. You are a clever man, but, for example, this book you have just published is a complete failure. The manuscript you gave me to read was an exciting story, but the book you have published is not exciting at all. It is boring. Why did you change it so much?"
I thought the story was a little too strong,
Wade said.
I thought it might make someone angry or unhappy.
And there's something else.
Manningtree said.
I know you are an excellent chess player. Why aren't you competing in the national chess competition?
I don't think I can win,
Wade said.
How do you know that?
I don't know for certain, but I'm sure I'm not the best player in the country.
Your problem, Wade,
Manningtree said,
is that you have no confidence in yourself. I'm sure that if you were more confident, you could be very successful in everything.
Oh, I don't think so,
Wade said.
Every time I try to do something, I am sure I shall fail.
The reason you think that,
Manningtree said,
is that you suffer from nerves.
How do you know that it is nerves?
It is obvious that you are a very nervous person. You worry about everything. You worry that you will fail. You worry that you will make someone angry. You worry that people may not like you. All you do is worry, Wade.
You're right,
Wade said.
I do worry, and I am nervous about everything, but what can I do about it?
There is a medicine that cures nerves,
Manningtree said.
Quack medicine?
Wade said.
I have no faith in such things.
It is not quack medicine,
Manningtree said.
One cannot buy it. I only have a little left, and I don't know how to make it.
Where did you get it from?
Wade asked.
A foreign patient gave it to me. He owed me money. He gave me the medicine instead of payment.
Have you taken it?
Oh, yes, it works very well.
You are certainly a very confident man,
Wade said.
But perhaps you always were.
That's possible,
Manningtree said.
But now I must go.
Manningtree left, and Wade sat at the window of his study, staring out at his garden. He knew that his problem was nervousness. Whatever he did, he failed at because of nerves. He was also very shy. This made it difficult for him to make friends, especially with young women. He wished he were not so nervous.
Chapter 2. The Prime Minister's Secret.
The next time Wade saw Manningtree, he said,
Could you let me have a little of that medicine? Just enough to see if it works. I'm sorry to trouble you.
I have only a very small amount left. It will take me some time to find out how to make more.
I will wait.
I may have to spend money,
Manningtree said.
I have money.
Wade said.
I will pay you anything you ask.
Don't give me anything now, but promise to pay me $10,000 when you become Prime Minister.
Wade laughed.
That's impossible,
he said.
I shall never become Prime Minister.
Who knows?
Manningtree said.
Give me a week and I'll see what I can do.
A week passed. Then Manningtree came to visit Wade again. He brought with him a small bottle.
I cannot find out how to make more of this medicine,
he said.
But you can have what's left. I don't need it anymore.
That's very generous of you,
Wade said.
How can I ever thank you?
Just take one small drop of the medicine once a month,
Manningtree said. Wade took the bottle from his friend. Once a month he took one small drop. The effect was immediate. Suddenly he was not nervous anymore. He was not shy anymore either. He was confident of his abilities. He entered the national chess competition and won easily. He started a business and within a year became a millionaire. He met and married one of the country's most intelligent and beautiful women and had 2 lovely children with her. He ran for parliament and was elected. Within 2 years, he was a minister. 2 years later, he became prime minister. One day, he went to see Manningtree.
You have come to give me $10,000.
Manningtree said with a laugh.
Forget it. I don't want it.
You can certainly have it if you want it,
Wade said.
but that is not the reason I have come to see you.
Oh? And what is the reason?
Manningtree asked.
I have almost finished the medicine you gave me.
Wade said.
Have you found out how to make it?
Again, Manningtree laughed.
Oh, yes.
He said.
I have known how to make it for a long time. I knew how to make it when I was at school.
What do you mean?
Wade demanded.
My dear friend and Prime Minister,
Manningtree said.
the medicine I gave you was just a bottle of distilled water.
But the color.
Oh, I added some coloring.
Then the medicine did me no good.
Wade said.
It didn't need to. There was nothing wrong with you. All you needed was to have confidence in yourself.
You deceived me.
Wade said.
You lied to me.
If you think that, then you are finished, Wade.
Manningtree said.
Listen, you have had a good time. You will have an even better time.
But now I must have faith in myself.
Wade said.
I don't know if I can.
He turned angrily on his friend.
Why did you tell me the truth? Why didn't you just give me another bottle of your colored distilled water? I can't go on.
He ran crying from the room. Manningtree jumped to his feet.
Wade, stop!
He shouted.
I was joking. It wasn't distilled water. It really was
But the damage was done. Wade hurried home. He began to think about his work as prime minister. He worried that it was too much for him. He thought he would make mistakes from now on. His successful career was over.
3. The Strange Story of Brownlow's Newspaper.
If I did not know Brownlow well, I would not believe this story. But I know him well. Like all of us, he tells small lies sometimes, but never big lies. And he has no reason to lie about his newspaper. He told me that he had dinner with some friends in their apartment and then went home by taxi. He opened the door of his apartment. The day was a Wednesday, one of the days when his cleaning lady did not come. His letters and evening newspaper were on the floor just inside the door. He picked them up and took them into his sitting room. He made himself a hot drink, sat down, and opened his mail. There was nothing of much interest, mainly bills. Then he picked up his newspaper. He had the Evening Standard delivered to his apartment Monday to Saturday. There was no paper on Sunday. The newspaper was in a wrapper as usual, but it was a different color. He was surprised to see that the name on the wrapper was not his own. It was the name of someone unknown to him. I have seen this wrapper, so I know that Brownlow is telling the truth about it. The name and address on the wrapper was Evan O'Hara, Mr., Sussex Court, 49. The name was wrong and the address was right, but unusually written. The usual way was 49 Sussex Court. Also, Mr. is usually written in front of a name, not after it. Brownlow decided that Mr. O'Hara had his newspaper and he had Mr. O'Hara's. This was not important as both newspapers were the Evening Standard, except that his newspaper was called the Even Standard. The front page headline was Successful Wilton Boring Wretches 7 Kilums. More spelling mistakes, he thought, and guessed that the news story was about oil. He sat back in his chair and began to read. Within a couple of minutes, he realized that he was reading a newspaper about events in another world. He looked at the date at the top of the newspaper, November 10th, 2051. But the date in our world was November 10th, 2001. And the paper was full of strange spellings, and it was printed on metallic paper, nothing like his usual Evening Standard. Brownlow now began to think that someone was playing a joke on him, but he could not understand why any of his friends would do such a thing. The cost of producing such a newspaper would be very high, far too much to pay for a silly joke. The more he thought about the contents of the newspaper, the more he thought it was real. The Wilton story was especially convincing. It explained that there was now no need to dig into the earth for coal. The heat from deep below the surface of the earth could be brought up and used instead of coal. It was cleaner and cheaper. It solved the carbon dioxide problem that was causing global warming. Apart from the importance of the front page news story, the paper was full of unusual things. There were many articles on scientific subjects, and the pictures of fashions were especially interesting. The world was obviously warmer because the clothing was simple, and it left most of the body bare. The main item of clothing was a lightweight cloak. Everyone seemed to be wearing some kind of large bracelet on one of their arms. There were photographs of people in African and Indian cities, and they all looked well and prosperous. There were no photographs of starving children or wars. This was very unlike the newspapers of our own time. The only sad story was about the death of a gorilla. It was the last gorilla on Earth. One page was full of statistics. The most interesting, Brownlow thought, was about the birth rate. It was 7 per 1,000, he told me. This was amazing. It was a fraction of our own birth rate, which was already not very high. The article did not give figures for different countries. There was only one birth rate, and that was for the whole world. I asked Brownlow about crime. There was still crime, he told me, but the articles were more about the causes of crime than catching criminals. He told me many more things that he read in the newspaper.
I read until I fell asleep,
he said.
I did not wake until my cleaning lady came and woke me up the next morning. I looked for the newspaper,
he said,
but I could not see it. There was only a torn piece of the wrapper on the floor. I jumped up and ran into the kitchen. My cleaning lady was there. I asked her where the newspaper was.
I threw it in the other garbage down the chute as I usually do, she said. I expect it is in the hot water furnace by now. The caretaker usually burns all the garbage as soon as it comes down. Brownlow ran down to the basement where the furnace was, but he was too late. There was no sign of the newspaper. So you have no proof that the newspaper existed, I said.
No, only this. I found it on the floor in my sitting room.
He handed me the wrapper. The paper was green, and the address was Evan O'Hara, Mr., Sussex Court, 49. And that is all I know about Brownlow's strange newspaper. I have no explanation for it. I only know that if his story is true, on the 10th November 2051, Evan O'Hara, Mr., will get a newspaper addressed to Brownlow dated 10th November 2001.
4. The Empire of Ants. Chapter 1. An Expert on the Ants. I have been ordered to take this gunboat to Batama.
Captain Garrelode told Holroyd, the boat's engineer.
What for?
Holroyd demanded.
There's nothing of interest there. I know, but I have my orders. We have to kill the ants. Kill the ants?
Holroyd exclaimed.
I've never heard of such an order. Neither have I until today,
the captain said.
Who cares about ants? They come and they go. There was a plague of ants in Trinidad. They were little ants that carried leaves. They came into the houses. They ate all the other insects. Then they left.
The captain had to obey orders. He spent the day loading stores onto the boat. He found out as much as he could about the ants in Batama. The next morning the boat set off up the river. The weather was hot. On either side of the river there was thick jungle. In the river there were alligators. In the jungle there were snakes, monkeys, and creatures of all kinds. From time to time the gunboat stopped at a riverside village. The captain asked the village people questions about the ants.
These ants,
He told Holroyd later,
they are very big. They are huge. Some are 5 centimeters long. Some are even bigger. They are eating up the country. I spoke to the people in the village who have come from upriver. Their homes are finished, eaten by the ants. We had to get away, they said, or the ants would eat us too. One man went back. The ants won't still be there, he thought. They will have moved on. He was wrong. The ants were still there. They attacked him. Yes, they attacked him. They bit him all over. He ran to the river and jumped in. He drowned the ants, but...
The captain paused and shook his head.
That night,
He went on,
he died, as if from a snake bite. Poisoned?
Holroyd said.
By ant bites? Who knows?
The captain said.
It is possible. What am I doing here? I became a gunboat captain to fight men. Now I have to fight ants. It is ridiculous.
The captain spent a lot of time talking to people about the ants. He had become somewhat of an expert on the ants.
Can they see?
Holroyd asked. The captain wasn't sure. He left the boat and came back with some ants of different kinds.
Some have eyes.
He said.
Some don't. The ants at Badama have big eyes. They sit in corners and watch you. Then they attack. That is what the villagers tell me. Do ants bite or sting?
Holroyd wanted to know.
They sting. Yes, they sting.
The captain said.
And there is poison in the sting. These ants, they come and come. I do not know what we can do about them. But the villagers say that these ants do not go.
Holroyd said. The captain thought for a moment. Then he said,
That is true, but they will go. They must go.
The boat continued traveling up the river. It stopped at every village, and Garolo found out more about the ants.
These ants,
He told Holroyd,
they live in huge communities. They are intelligent and they have some kind of language. Perhaps like us, they can store knowledge.
He added.
Perhaps they are planning a war against us. They use poison like snakes. They eat anything and everything. They come and they stay.
The jungle was now very quiet. Garolo tried to sleep, but he dreamt of ants, and from time to time he shouted in his sleep.
Chapter 2. Ants Attack.
The next morning, as they were continuing up the river, they saw a boat coming toward them. She seemed to be just drifting. The captain put his binoculars to his eyes and studied the boat.
I can see 2 men on the boat,
He said.
but they are not moving. They are sitting on the deck with their backs to the mast.
As he spoke, the small boat moved suddenly in a wave. The men fell to one side and then lay on the deck. They did not move. One of the men's hats fell off. His bare head looked horrible. The captain turned to Holroyd.
Did you see that? Yes, they are dead. We'd better go see. There's something wrong.
Holroyd said.
Did you see his head? His face?
The captain demanded.
What was it like? It was... there are no words to describe it.
The captain gave orders to his crew, and the gunboat moved alongside the small drifting boat. He saw that there were only 2 men on board, both dead. Their faces, arms, and hands were red and raw, bare to the bone. Holroyd borrowed the captain's binoculars.
It's ants,
He said.
I can see them. Thousands of them all over the bodies. They are black and much larger than ordinary ants.
The captain turned to Dakuna, the lieutenant on the gunboat.
Go aboard,
He said.
Find out what's going on. But what about the ants?
Dakuna asked.
They will...
The captain interrupted him.
You have boots.
He said.
I know, sir, but...
The lieutenant did not want to go aboard the small boat.
Obey my orders.
The captain shouted at him. Holroyd was still studying the ants through the binoculars.
I believe those men were killed by the ants.
He said.
And they are not ordinary ants. It's not that they are bigger than other ants. They move their bodies in a different way. It looks as if there is something strapped to their bodies, some kind of metallic band, and one in about 20 of them is much larger than the others."
By now the lieutenant was on board the small boat. He walked up to one of the dead men and turned him over. Immediately, thousands of ants came out of the man's clothing. The lieutenant jumped up and down, stamping on them with his heavy boots. The ants moved away, but then turned and seemed to stare at him. This was not the way ordinary ants behaved.
"Go forward,"
the captain shouted at the lieutenant.
"Find out what's on the rest of the boat."
Unhappily, the lieutenant walked forward. He turned over the other dead man. Immediately, ants poured out of his clothing. They stood still for a moment, almost as if awaiting orders. Then, led by the larger ants, raced toward the lieutenant. He attempted to stamp on them, but there were too many. Soon they were climbing up his clothes. He screamed and jumped over the side of the boat into the river. He swam
Chapter
toward the
3.
gunboat.
The
3
future
crewmen
rulers
pulled
of
him
Earth.
aboard. He was unable to
He
walk.
said I murdered him.
That night, the captain said to Holroyd,
Someone had to go on board. I couldn't. I'm the captain. What are we supposed to do? Run away from the ants whenever we see them?
Holroyd said nothing. He was thinking of the lieutenant's swollen body, full, he was sure, of poison.
We'll have to sink that boat,
the captain said after a long silence.
And then what do we do? I don't know. Yes, I know. We'll burn every ant on that boat.
He ordered the crew to soak rags with kerosene. Then they threw the rags onto the small boat. There was a flash and a roar. Almost immediately, the boat was on fire.
Let's go on,
the captain said. He gave the order and the gunboat continued upriver toward Batama. They arrived at the village later that day. There was no one to be seen. The village was deserted.
All the people have gone,
the captain said.
But just in case.
He gave an order and a crewman blew the ship's whistle. No one came. The gunboat was now near the jetty. Holroyd studied it through the binoculars.
I can see ants,
he said.
And there's a human skeleton on the jetty. Where are all the villagers?
The captain asked.
Have they run away? If they have, we must find them and get them to come onto the boat. We'll take them away from here.
Holroyd said nothing. The captain said,
But how can I send men on shore? They will be attacked by the ants. They will be poisoned. They will die, blaming me. Then what can we do?
Holroyd asked. The captain thought about this. Then he said,
I shall fire our big gun.
They shot the big gun again and again. It destroyed the village, but the ants were still there. The jetty was full of them.
It's no good,
the captain said to Holroyd.
There's nothing I can do. We must go back and ask for instructions.
The captain returned to England and told the story. From time to time there was news about the ants. They were moving slowly toward the coast, taking over towns and villages. There seemed to be no way of stopping them. Soon they will control all of South America. And then, how long before they take over the planet?
5. The door in the wall.
Lionel Wallace told me that the first time he saw the door in the wall, he was 5 years of age.
It was sometime in October. I remember that the leaves were gold, red, and brown, so it was autumn. My mother was dead, and my father was a busy lawyer, often away from home. I spent a lot of time on my own, walking in the streets for hours without my governess knowing, or caring, where I was. I can't remember exactly where I was when I saw the door in the wall. It was, I am sure, a poor part of the city. I remember small, dirty shops. The door in the wall was green. At first, I walked past it, then I turned back. I don't know why. I just felt I had to open that door and find out what was on the other side. It was extraordinary. I was in the poorest part of town, but behind that green door was an amazing garden. And not just a garden. There were wonderful animals. I remember 2 beautiful leopards came up to me. They were as gentle as the cats at home, and they let me stroke them. The garden was huge. I could see hills in the distance. What was also strange was that I felt I knew the place. It was like coming home. I wasn't at all afraid. And then a little girl of my own age, perhaps she was a year or 2 older, came up to me. She kissed me and took my hand. We walked together through the garden. Monkeys came up and played with us. There were fountains and other beautiful things. There were people walking around. They all seemed friendly and happy. I saw love for me and for one another in their eyes. I was a lonely child, and now, for the first time, I had playmates. We played wonderful games. And then a woman in a dark robe came up to me. She told me to follow her. My playmates didn't want me to go and called to me to come back quickly. The woman took me into a large room. She sat down, and I stood beside her. She opened a large book and put it on her knee so that I could see it. The pages were full of pictures. They weren't ordinary pictures. They were moving pictures, and they were pictures of everything in my life since I was born. I saw my mother, our house, and the street we lived on. At last, we came to the present. There was a picture of me in the poor street with its small, dirty shops. I was crying. I was crying because I was not with my new friends and could not find the way back to them. And then I realized that I was not looking at a page in the book. I was back in that street, alone and unhappy. When I got home, my governess was very angry with me for being so late. She told my father, and he punished me. I tried to explain, but they did not believe me. My father said I was too imaginative. He took all my books away from me, all my favorite fairy tales. At night, I dreamed of my garden. I wanted to go back to it more than anything else in the world.
I asked Lionel if he tried to find it again.
No,
He said.
I had no chance. My governess was with me all the time. I was not allowed out of the house on my own until I started school a year or so later. Then one day, when I was looking for a different and more interesting way to school, I found the green door again.
Did you open it and go in? I asked Lionel.
No,
He said.
I wanted to, but I was already late for school. I did not want to be punished. I'll go in on my way home, I thought, and ran off to school. But I was so excited that I had to tell someone, and I told one of the boys. Hopkins, his name was. I told him my secret. What a fool I was. He told the other boys. They called me a liar. They told me I had to prove I wasn't a liar. I had to take them to the door in the wall.
And did you take them? I asked Lionel.
I tried to,
He said.
but I couldn't find it. They beat me up for being a liar.
And did you ever find the door again? I asked.
Yes, I found it 3 more times, but for one reason or another, I did not stop to open it and go inside. I was successful in my career and always in a hurry to a meeting. On one occasion, I was going to meet the young woman who became my wife. I was more interested in seeing her than in the door. She was angry with me for so often being late that I knew I dare not risk being late again, so I decided to come back to the door another day.
And did you?
Yes, but the door was not there. Next time I see it, I shall stop and open it. I shall not miss another chance.
This was the last conversation that I or anyone who knew him had with Lionel Wallace. He simply disappeared. The question we all ask ourselves, of course, is did he find the door and go in and never come out again? Or is there another reason for his disappearance? We shall never know.
Playlet, the time machine.
Our friend is late.
Yes, he should be here by now.
Perhaps he is working in his laboratory and has forgotten the time.
That is very likely. Shall we go into the laboratory?
Yes, but knock on the door first.
He is not there. Then let's go in. We can look at his time machine.
Yes, he said it would be finished this week. I don't believe in time machines. It is not possible to travel in time.
I agree. If we could go back in time, we could kill our great-grandfathers, and then we would not be born. Exactly. Therefore, we would not exist now.
And if we could travel forward? We could change things only if we could bring some things or some knowledge back from the future.
I'd like to see his machine, even if it is just nonsense. Very well. Let's go into the laboratory. But we mustn't touch anything. There's no machine in here, time or any other kind.
Something was standing here. I can see oil. Whatever it was small. There is no window in this room and the door is narrow.
Let's go back into the library. We'll wait half an hour, and if he doesn't come, we'll go and leave a message for him.
What was that? What's happening? I don't know. The noise is coming from the laboratory.
I'm going back in. Be careful.
I don't believe it. How did that machine get here?
Where have you been? Are you all right?
Let me help you.
Please go back into the library. I must wash and change my clothes. Be patient. I will tell you everything.
It's impossible. When we first went into the laboratory, there was no machine there.
I agree.
Then how did the machine get there? We all agreed that there is no window and that the door is too narrow. There is no way the machine could have gotten into that room.
Unless he built the machine in the room.
We know he did that, but how did he get the machine out of the room and back into it? He was talking about a fourth dimension. Space has 3 dimensions, and we can move about in those dimensions. If time is a fourth dimension, perhaps we can move about in that, as he said.
We shall soon know because he will tell us where he has been.
But how will we know if he is telling the truth? How can he prove that he has been backwards or forwards in time? I don't think he can prove it.
I can prove that I have moved out of the present, but I can't prove that I have been into the future or into the past. Look at this. You are a famous scientist, a botanist, an expert on plants. Study this flower. Tell me what it is.
It is most interesting. It is completely different from any flower I have ever seen.
There are flowers in the jungles of the Amazon that no one has ever seen. No one has ever been into those jungles. That is true. Then, if this is a flower from the Amazon, how did I get there and back in less than an hour? That's a good question.
All I can say is that this flower is not of our time. Perhaps it is prehistoric, from the time of the dinosaurs.
It is from the future, and when I have told you my story, then perhaps you will believe me. My machine took me 150 years into the future. The world is a very different place. There are 2 races of creatures, the Eloi and the Morlocks. The Eloi are small, gentle creatures, people who lead peaceful lives. They do no work but play games, eat food, and sleep. They seem to be happy, although their lives are, by our standards, boring. They are afraid of the dark.
And the Morlocks?
These are ape-like creatures who live underground. They are afraid of the light. They have machines. They provide the Eloi with everything they need. So the Morlocks are the Eloi's slaves. Sadly, that is not so. The Eloi are the Morlocks' cattle. The Morlocks feed them and breed them for food.
That is horrible. How did the Eloi allow this to happen?
They became lazy. At first, they allowed the Morlocks to provide them with everything they needed. Then they slowly lost all their skills. Exactly. As the years passed, they became more and more dependent on the Morlocks. Eventually, they could not take care of themselves. Then, the Morlocks took control of them.
There is a lesson for us in this. Only if his strange story is true